see. Jacquire, say hello to the nice people here.
Hello, nice people.
All
Very
right.
nice to be with you, Justin.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. I mean, assuming pretty much everyone who's here in the Q&A probably just saw the live premiere of Jaquire's masterclass for MixCon. Really good one. I want to give a big thanks and shout out to, first of all, Universal Audio for sponsoring it, helping us make it free to the public. He was doing the entire mix inside of Luna, which was super cool. And big thanks to the band, Oliver Hazard. Really cool track. A lot of people were saying positive things about it in the chat there. And we do see your questions coming in. So two things. One, type in where you're joining us from in the Q&A down below and ask away with some questions. Jacquire, any opening remarks from you, or do you want me to just get straight into some of these questions here? We've already gotten some coming in.
Let's just get into it. Let's answer some people's questions. I appreciate everybody being here, and I'm happy to be doing this. So, but let's make it worthwhile for them. Let's answer some questions.
All right. Starting with, I hope I'm saying your name right, Gerhard Schoner. He says, your compressors had about a 4-to-1 ratio on the vocals in the mix with about 8 dB of reduction. What was your compression ratio while recording? And can you recall how much reduction you were doing while you were tracking?
It would be similar. I know that, gosh, I used analog compressors. Griffin, I believe, was on the LA2A. So that's, 2 to 4, dB ratio, depending on how hard you're hitting it. And my 176 was set to 2-to-1 ratio. And then the other was a stay level. I'm not exactly sure. It's in a similar, those are all tube compressors. And so there's similar ratios, sometimes hitting them pretty hard. So what is noticed and visual in the mix is also sort of relatively close to what my tracking compression was. And, if you can pick the right compressor for the voice and manage the gain properly, I end up using a lot of compression on the vocals. So,
yeah, they sound great. I remember seeing those needles move a lot in those 176s, but it's like it sounded good, then that's it.
Yeah, well, the thing is like the attack and release is so variable on those units that you really can tailor it to the, to the brightness of the voice and the tempo of the song and just sort of the phrasing to get it to just be transparent. Yeah, there's a lot of compression, but I mean, we record everything pretty much these days with so much loudness that the only way to kind of get a vocal to kind of keep up is to really put a decent amount of compression on it. If you watch somebody like Al Schmidt mix, Al doesn't really compress anything other than the vocal a little bit, and he's able to do that because his style and a lot of the music he records. I mean, he's amazing, and if any of you don't know who Al Schmidt is, you should look. He's got a great book. Look him up. He's got a great book called On the Record. But the more dynamic, I just point that out just because the more dynamic the music is, the more dynamic the voice can be. Now, Oliver Hazard is pretty dynamic music, but we're trying to present it a little bit more in a modern space. And so the bigger sections are, they get pretty loud. So I'm trying to have the vocal kind of at that same level the whole time. There's obviously a little bit of automation and so forth, but yeah, just trying to keep it all very sturdy and leveled out.
Yeah, good stuff. And I guess some of the reasons that some of those compressors that you use a lot stood the test of time and people are using them decades after decades after they were designed is because they can do that kind of thing of do a significant amount of compression while allowing you to keep things pretty transparent.
Yeah.
Right, another question from Gerard. He's asking this one for a friend named, he has scare quotes here, Svengali, who's afraid to ask himself, do you have any little tricks or rituals you do to get the mood right before working with the artist, recording or mixing?
No rituals. I mean, we don't, there's, I just try to have a comfortable, clean environment, make sure that, okay, I thought I put my phone on Do Not Disturb. Hold on a second.
No worries. So you leave your phone off when the artist arrives. That's step
Yeah,
number
for
one.
sure. Okay, how can I get back to you? I've lost you. There you are. Sorry. No, there's no rituals. I mean, it's about having a comfortable environment. It's some singers want to be in a vocal booth, or they don't want you looking at them. So be able, set them up. Sometimes, if you're recording in one room, have them face away from you, or you face away from them, or just sort of figure out how to make someone comfortable. That's the most important thing. So there's no trick to it. There's no ritual. It's just about good communication, being set up and ready to record, especially when you get to recording vocals. Because once someone starts singing and their voice is warm and they kind of like get into it and let that, because sometimes they have to let their inhibitions go. They need to feel like they're in a private, kind of safe environment where you're there to help them, not to judge them.
Hmm.
It's just really kind of creating a comfortable environment. So, but being a good communicator, as soon as someone finishes a vocal take, you communicate with them. I typically try to say something positive, um, and then, follow it up with maybe a little bit of a direction, or, a little bit of criticism or observation. I don't say, like if someone's singing pitchy, I don't say, okay, well, that's pretty pitchy. We're going to need to work on that. I don't say it that way. It's like, okay, how are your headphones? Are you hearing? Is there anything I can do to change the headphones? Sounding good. Sounds like we're warming up. Let's focus on the phrasing here. It's a little pitchy here. If there's anything I can do to help, approach it that way. It's like they know they are likely to understand that they're not quite on it yet. So you don't have to kind of like put it in their face. It's just really about making people comfortable and inspiring, and then making them feel like they're in a secure place to be inspired and work.
Yeah. Oh, great answer. All right, moving on to a couple more questions here. This one, I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce your name. It's written in a bit of an Eastern European looking language to me. Maybe it's Sepran. You have to tell me exactly how to say it. But he says, "Hi, Jacquire. I really like your approach to mixing. It seems simple enough and very productive at the same time. How did you come to not try to complicate things so much? And what advice can you give to those who like to complicate their life and their mixes?"
Well, listen, sometimes mixing does have to be complicated. It depends on the source material, where you're trying to put it, where you're trying to place it. I've, I didn't mix the Oliver Hazard in Luna because, you know, because Universal Audio is like hosting this thing, or sponsoring it. I mixed it in Luna because Luna sounds really great, and with the tape emulation and everything that it does, it helps me get to my result faster. Listen, when I started out in the studio over 30 years ago, the process wasn't, I wouldn't call it simple, but it was simple by today's standards in terms of all the tools we have and all the things we can throw at something. You know, I worked in a nice studio with a 24 track and, a big console, but I don't think we had more than like 8 compressors
Mhm.
total. So it's not like I could put it's not like you had unlimited compressors to put on everything. And we maybe had a couple outboard EQs. Most of it was the EQ on the desk. So, you know, things were simple. Over time, as recording consoles got bigger, and now we have these DAWs, we've been able to create these more complicated ways of doing things. And while at times that's appropriate and useful, and I certainly went through some phases and periods of my career where I was mixing things way more complicated than I am now. But as technology has caught up, like has digital technology and working in the computer has caught up with what a great analog sound is, or was, however you want to phrase it. Um, it has allowed me to go back to a simpler approach. Now, I've also discovered over time that a simpler approach is the better way to start, and then you can figure out how maybe deep you need to dig down on something, for how complicated you need to to make it, to get it to your result. At the end of the day, what you always are going to need with a mix, no matter how many tracks you have, is you need a good mix bus.
Hmm.
So, and it doesn't matter how many elements you have. You can have 8, you can have 80. Balance your elements, put a mix treatment on them, and then go from there. It's just like, don't just start throwing, don't start throwing EQs and compressors on everything just because you think that's mixing. Start with the big gestures. Make a balance of your elements. Put a treatment on it, like a summing bus treatment, and then work from there. Sometimes you need parallel compression on drums. Sometimes you don't. It's just like, in the Oliver I have the session up in front of me.
Nice.
Let's see, just so that I wouldn't forget. It's a very simple process, and I do have a little bit of parallel compression, but it's not a major player in the sound. I mean,
Hmm.
the drums wouldn't feel as present and full all the time if I took the parallel compression away. But volume wise, you'd still hear the drums, and it would be okay. It's just not maybe as impactful or toneful as having a little bit of parallel compression. But I guess trial and error. It's just like, I went through my phases of editing things too much and
Hmm.
worrying too much about the grid, and those things are good. It's good to learn how to do those things, but then once you get a little bit further along, you understand how to use the tools, and then you have the wisdom of how and when to use a process and
Right.
a technique. It's not about knowing. I know, like, encyclopedias worth of information and techniques around record making, but I don't throw all the books at everything I do. It's just like, oh, sometimes I refer to chapter 12, or sometimes it's 200,
Hmm.
depending on what it is you need. So,
Yeah, I get it. Now, just out of curiosity, my own question here,
yeah.
the process you've come to now where you really showed us where you're starting kind of with your mix bus, starting with first getting level balances and very quickly putting on your mix bus, and then almost working in a way that some people would think is backwards when they're first starting out, starting with the mix bus processing, then going back to the subgroups, and then going back to individual tracks as needed. Was that informed by your analog days of working, or is it something totally new that you had to develop for digital? How did you kind of come to that conclusion of, hey, this is the best way for me to start with my in the box mixes?
Well, I just think over time I learned. I just sort of, upon mixing, whatever, thousands of songs, I just was able to reflect on, like, where I was spending my time, how I was spending my time, and where I was making the most significant change.
Mhm.
And when you start kind of dialing down on the individual tracks first and trying to get things to sound, what you think is good, you really are wasting your time, because it's like, you can tweeze away on the drum kit and the snare drum for quite a long time, and then you turn the rest of the stuff on and put it with it, and it's like, well, gosh, it doesn't really all fit together. So it's just like, kind of put it all together, and then sort out. It's just like, it's like maybe like taking a photo, I guess. It's
Mhm.
like, you got people of different heights, right? It's just like, okay, guys, let's gather around, and then you sort of step back and you look at the group and say, hey, can you come down front, because we're only seeing the top of your head, and you step to the back because you're taller than everybody else. And it's
Mhm.
just like, hey, you two with the blue shirts, it looks kind of funny with you standing next to each other. Can you kind of, I don't know, maybe that's a good
Yeah.
analogy or
That's a
not.
great analogy. Yeah.
So it's just like, kind of look at all your pieces, and then sort of frame it. So basically what I'm doing is I'm gathering all my people for the photo, and I'm framing the photo with my mix bus. And
Mhm.
then once I do that, once I have the basic composition sort of, in mind, then I'm going and addressing what needs to happen.
Right. No, that
And
makes a
it,
lot of
it
sense. I really like that analogy. And I have had the same experience with you where you can going through that process where you start with the kick drum and then you spend 30 minutes on the kick drum, then you go to the snare, and then you're an hour into the mix and you're like, oh man, there's 112 tracks left. It's not necessarily the most inspiring process. And like you said, you can make those big judgments first, and then working your way backwards, it becomes so much faster. So anyone who hasn't tried this approach that you talk about here, it's really what I recommend to so many people. And it was great to see you go through it in such detail. It
Yeah,
really is
thanks. Well,
fast and effective, and you're great at communicating the whys and letting us hear how it comes together. All right, some more questions from the audience. Cristobal Reyes says, when you spread bass in the stereo field, how do you avoid phase issues? I think we can kind of open up that question a little bit more, because the problem isn't necessarily phase, because they're two distinct bass parts. But how do you avoid the idea of the stereo spreading bass that you did here causing trouble in one way or another?
well, I mean, I don't know that it really would cause trouble. I mean, it's no, I, well, I guess I
It's one of
don't
those things that
understand.
people are cautioned about,
Yeah,
all
I don't
the
know why, I don't know why anybody
magazines.
would be afraid of panning a bass out. You know, it's just like, now if it might cause trouble, if the bass elements weren't somewhat on equal footing. I mean, if
Mhm.
one was really much like had much more low frequency than the other, I mean,
Mhm.
that might cause a little imbalance. But as long as they're fairly equal, the reason that I panned them apart is because they were similar enough and they were supporting each other, but they weren't doing exactly the same thing. So I was just taking advantage, instead of just laying them on top of each other and them sort of obscuring each other, I was kind of highlighting the fact that I had two different bass sounds.
Yeah.
I don't really think, listen, a lot of records for the longest time were all done in mono,
Mhm.
and then when stereo came along, originally they were making stereo mixes and they didn't really care about the stereo mixes. They thought it was kind of a waste of time, and they were very cavalier about how they did it,
Mhm.
you know and there's tons and tons of records where stereo was a thing in terms of the mix, but all the recordings, everything was in mono, so you had a whole drum kit and a like a bass. Maybe they put the drums, the bass, and some percussion all on one track on the 4-track, and they
Mhm.
just decided, okay, we're going to put that on the left, and then they put the voice and the guitar all on the right.
Yep.
And I mean, when I was very young, little, a young person, like a kid listening to records that were mixed that way, I didn't ever notice really until I became more informed about the stereo field and those choices. I never noticed that their voice was only
Yeah.
coming out of the right hand side. You
I
kind of hear,
remember the first time I really noticed a big time in my, mid-20s being an audio guy. I remember being at a bar, and I was at one end of the bar, and there was a speaker at one end of the bar, and then all the way down at the other end of the bar, there's another speaker, and there was a Beatles song that came on, and I had just Paul McCartney and a tambourine. And that's all I had. And down you had to run to the other end of the bar. It's like, oh, there's the band.
hey, yeah.
You don't
So
necessarily notice that on
I don't think, yeah. So it's like, I don't think you really can get in trouble. I mean, because that's making an artistic choice. And
yeah.
like I said, even if the bass parts didn't have the commonalities that they do in the Saratoga song, making that, I mean, it still could be interesting. It
Mhm.
still could be interesting. Now, it might get you in a little trouble if you've got the kick drum in the middle and the heavy bass is only off to maybe the left side. I mean, that might get you a little in trouble depending on how hard you're hitting the stereo bus.
Yeah.
But I don't think so. It's nothing to be afraid of.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. I think that everybody listening, I hope that you understand and embrace the idea that you've come here to listen to folks on Sonic Scoop that have experience, and this is a place of expertise and information, but it's not about creating rules or boundaries for you. It's just like, it's information, and then you should be able to take that information and go boldly and you know do something inspired and creative. And it's like, if it works, it works. There's nothing wrong. There's no wrongs. It's like, if people enjoy the music, that's all that matters.
Mhm. Now, to editorialize only for a moment on this base idea, and just to give a couple of seconds, just because this came up, or I believe it was late last week, I had a mastering client. Well, first of all, one of the reasons I think people back in the day would say, be careful of stereo bass, is because there was that thing when people were cutting records back in the day that you could literally pop the needle out of a record when that was the format. So maybe that's why that advice developed. For this particular artist, they were trying to do something similar to what you did, where they had very, very stereo bass feel. They literally took the isotope imager and in the low end, spread the low end by like 90% on one of these stereo imagers. So like way spread it. And I was listening to it against their references, and their references were a lot of like, oh, dancey electronic stuff with a super solid center. And I said to him, it's like, hey, here's how the master, things are sounding good. One thing I noticed, it sounded different than a lot of your references in that almost all of the references had a really centered kick drum and bass, and yours sounds really out there. And I said, it's not necessarily wrong, because what you got out of this track is you got the sense of like atmosphere, like it's like the bass is giving you this warm enveloping hug, but it's not a center, four on the floor type of like, dancey bass thing. So it's that stuff, the context of knowing what's appropriate for the genre, for what the artist is trying to realize. And you picked something here where like, it makes sense. We're trying to make this thing this, to give it this sense of like openness and width, and that's beautiful. But then on the dance track, maybe you don't want to do that, and you want the centered kick and the centered bass. So the
Well, no,
context is big.
those are two very good points, and I, yeah, of course I mean, it would be dangerous to have heavy bass on an LP vinyl where it was all to one side. Now,
Yeah.
in the example we were just talking about, the band was at the other, on the other speaker at the other end of the bar. I mean, so the bass player was there, but they didn't really cut vinyl with as heavy bass as we're used
Right.
to now. And like, if you want a diffused sort of bass, I mean, they could have done a filter to where the bass spread was maybe 100, 200 cycles and above, and then they kept everything below 200 more focused in the center. I mean, that's another way, because really, when the bass is coming out of speakers, 100 and below, it's really hard to tell in a lot of cases where it's coming from, because it's such a diffuse energy anyways. So there's a lot of ways to approach it, and there are no rules, but those are very good examples, Justin.
Cool. All right, moving on a little further here. Paul Cook asks, how much time is too much time to spend on a song at the mixing stage, I suppose?
In the mixing stage? Well,
do you have time targets that you try to hit at all?
Yeah, I try. I mean, I try to do. I try to do the bulk of the work in, 3 to 6 hours. But that also that also requires. I'm able to rely on that preparation time. Okay, so sometimes it might take 1, 2, 3 hours to prepare a song for mix. Now, if I'm doing that for myself, then I tend to try to get things prepared and then step away from it, or do a bunch of that work one day, and then the next day sit down and start to actually mix. Or I have my assistant set stuff up, and then once I've gotten through sort of the first mix, I say, okay, well, now take the update that I've done to the template. Let's take the mix bus template from this first mix, and let's update all the other ones that are prepared. So I think the setup time should be sort of identified a little bit separate. I think it can be fatiguing to just sit down and from scratch start a mix, and then just kind of go through the setup stage that may take you an hour or more, and then keep pressing through the mix. It's just like, take a break from it. Like if you're going to mix a song from scratch in one day, like take the hour or two that it's going to take to get it all set up.
Yep.
Because you have to go through and make sure edits are clean. Depends on how somebody's delivered something to you, right? It could take 30 minutes, and then my target would be a few hours. Sometimes things take longer, and then I'm typically on the first mix on a project. I typically sleep on it. I'll do a mix. Now, if I can get 2 done in a day, then I'll sleep on them, come back the next day, see what I feel like could be better, and then touch them up, and then I might share them with the artist and move on to the next one. But I mean, if you get into a thing where if you're just grinding on this minutia detail, where you're spending 30 minutes on each track to try to get it to sound a certain way, you're probably spending too much time. You're not giving yourself, you're fatiguing yourself, you're not giving yourself perspective. It's hard to say. You might be able to mix something in a few hours, but then the client comes back and they have pages of notes that they want. You might feel good about it in 2 hours, and then you get back a bunch of notes that take another day of work, or and if you're in that situation, chances are that something is amiss. Like they didn't give you what they actually really want, and or it's just, or it's not a good pairing. But if you it's really hard to say when is it too much time, but you should be able to get through mixing a song in a day or less,
Mhm.
and then all the follow-up stuff should be 20-30 minutes at a time.
Yeah. All of this, I just couldn't agree with more. I mean, this sounds so much like the exact advice I love to give to people. And I like this idea of, if you don't have an assistant, taking time to be your own assistant, to do that work first. So you're not coming in and you've already spent 2 or 3 hours just now looking at all these tracks and putting everything together. And now you're supposed to get creative. I love that idea of compartmentalizing that work. Just some real great
Absolutely.
stuff here.
Yeah,
Uh,
like look at the different jobs, and kind of put yourself in different roles. Don't try and do it all at one time.
yeah.
I mean, sometimes you have to, but that's a really fatiguing way to go about it.
Oh, I've got another question of my own that's popped up in my head here that I wonder if I can ask. When it comes to compartmentalizing, you do a fair amount of what some people might consider mastering like things while you're mixing, in that you're not afraid to make compression choices, a little bit of peak stop limiting, and even some EQ choices on your main mix bus and the buses that are feeding into it. Since you are doing things like compression, some general sweetening, and even EQ on your mix bus, how do you see the role of a mastering engineer? Because you mentioned in your early on that mastering is still an important part of your process. You send the stuff off to mastering engineers. Why is mastering still an important part of your process? And how is that different from you just EQing and treating your main mix bus?
Sure, it's a very good question. It's there's several facets to it. The mastering I'll just say this, that the mastering process really was is born from it took a different equipment to get a mix to cut to vinyl. So someone had to sort of be in charge of that process. Well, over time, that person became more technically creative in getting the best result of the master tape onto the vinyl. Sometimes that took EQ and level, and there's different things. The skill and the science of being a mastering engineer was sort of born. And then what is also really important about the mastering process is that let's say you've mixed a whole album, you got 10 songs. Well, they're not going to be exactly all the same levels, because some songs are a little bit quieter, and you don't want to try to mix them at the same level, because you want to do things appropriately. Some songs are a little louder than others. Sometimes, because of the key, or the instruments involved, the way the bottom end shapes up, it varies from mix to mix. So the mastering engineer is kind of making things a little bit more uniform. They're someone they haven't ever heard the project. By the time you have mixed, even if you're only the mixer, you've spent probably easily 10 to 20 times the amount of time it will take a good mastering engineer to run down and make a little bit of sweetening EQ, because the mastering engineer is looking at all of these 10 songs at the same time, basically. They're not in the minutia. They have a stereo version of the song. It's just like, so they kind of like listen across them, kind of start to understand the aesthetic, find sort of a target. They're they have different equipment, different metering to deliver things to certain levels, because streaming level is different than CD. It's very difficult to try and manage a mix and then hit all of these different targets. And when you're mixing, you're listening to each song individually. The mastering engineer is kind of listening across the whole album. So they're getting the levels to be very similar. They're getting the EQ across all the songs to make them hang together a little bit better. Because one song may be a little bit darker than another one. And so it's either, well, do we brighten up the dark song, or do we tone down the bright song? It's like, how do they figure all that stuff out, get the levels right, the sequencing? It's very hard in a mix. I guess I do approach mixing with a little bit of a mastering sweetening. Um, but there's that extra gear, that extra layer of work that you can't really do when you're mixing. It's like it really needs to go on to another set of ears, another process. The gear is slightly different too for in a mastering situation. They do use some similar pieces of gear, but then there's also things that are very different and optimized for that process.
Yeah.
So I just think it's a very important thing. I want to send the mastering engineer as close to the finished project as I can possibly a product as I can possibly get it. And hopefully they don't need to do more than a few percent of work, but
Hmm.
it's just that getting that little extra bit out of it and making everything kind of stand together. That's why I think it's important.
Absolutely. And that's been my goal as a mastering engineer too, is that when I have to do the least, I know the record's going to turn out the best. And I almost feel like the most important part of my job is coaching a lot of the mixers I work with, so that the next time they hand in something, I have to do even less. And the next time I hand in something, I have to do even less. And they learn little things about their rooms. Like, hey, you've consistently had, a little more 60 hertz than some of the records you love the sound of, or you've consistently had a little bit more going on here, or, there's consistently been a little lower vocal than some of the records that I know you love. And once they hear those things, I'm doing less and less and less, almost to the point where like I'm afraid to start mastering, because I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna basically hand them back the same record, but they have to pay me anyway. So that's the goal, though, right?
Well, but that's the way it should be. It's just
Yeah.
also, you're. I mean, I use several different mastering engineers, but I love the relationship that I have with them, because it's kind of like, um, you know, because they'll tell me if there's something a little bit amiss. I learn from these relationships, and they're kind of like a confirmation, and they
Yeah.
put the final touch on it.
Hmm.
Because at the end of a record, once I have produced, engineered, and mixed a record, I've been listening to it for a long time,
Yep.
and there's something you just kind of get used to, some things sometimes that maybe could be better handled just slightly differently.
Hmm. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. All right, have taken up so far 30 minutes of Jaquire's time. Super generous, dude. Just give us an
Oh, no
hour and a
problem.
half masterclass. We build this at a 30-minute Q&A, but I think Jacquire said he can give us a little bit more time. So I want to go into a little bit of a lightning round here and see if we can go and get some more audience questions answered. Maybe I'll pick out some that we can answer a little bit more quickly. Bridget Blanchard from Valencia, Spain asks, what are some of your favorite tape emulations available? Which ones are you liking the most?
um Well, I mean, I like both. I mean, Oxide is. I mean, all of the stuff in the Universal Audio is really useful. And then Luna has the Studer 800, which I used all over the Oliver Hazard. I like the Isotope tape.
Mhm.
Um, I'm trying to think what the
Would be that the isotope tape that would be built into something like alloy or ozone, or is it a separate one?
I think it's a separate one. Let me see here if I can pull it up. But um, Oh, it's an Ozone 8. It's called
Nice.
Vintage Tape. It's
Yep.
called
Yep.
Vintage
Yeah,
Tape.
that's a good
I
one.
mean, Waves has the J37. I
Hmm.
mean, there are just so many. I mean, there's oh gosh, what is that cassette thing? Um,
Well,
they're all kind of useful. What's that, Justin?
I was gonna say, yeah, there's one recently, a cassette one that I saw. It's from the guy who's working with Neil now, but it was like it almost looks like an old Tascam 4-track cassette. Is that the one you're thinking of? I'll have to look that
No,
up.
but I would say my go-tos are the vintage tape, an
Hmm.
Ozone 8, the Studer, the ATR, and Universal Audio.
Hmm.
I love the Waves J37 on vocal. Like
Mm.
if you want like a little bit of grit and like focus on a vocal. The thing is they all, the J37 has different tape formulas than the Studer 800, right?
Right.
They have all these different qualities. So I mean, there's a lot of usefulness to them.
All
So
right. Well, let's keep on cruising
yeah,
through
let's
here.
keep going.
See if we can get through a few more. Digi's Dungeon asks, my question is, what are your favorite go-to vocal plugins?
Um, well, uh, I like to try to, well, vocal plugins. In terms of, I've been liking the 176, which I use in Oliver Hazard quite a lot
Right.
in terms of compression. I typically go with Fab Filter for just some surgical EQ. Um, and then it just sort of depends on the tonality of the voice. I mean, I'll try all kinds of things. I usually start with a Neve, but sometimes you end up with API. Sometimes you don't put any color EQ on there. Try not to use a de-esser unless I need it.
Hmm.
Um, I always like to use the Soundtoys Micro Pitch to add
Right.
a little bit of thickness to it. I always do at least one reverb and one delay for the vocals. They can really be anything. For a long time I used Soundtoys, the Echo Boy for tape
Hmm.
delays, but the Valhalla delay is really cool. A new one I really like. So yeah, I mean it just really depends on the voice. Just the Fab Filter for just basic surgical EQ, high pass, a little bit of basic tonal shaping is something I always use. And then you have to play around. It's like sometimes the Blue Stripe 1176 of the UA version works well. Sometimes it's the blackface. Sometimes it's the Waves Blue Stripe. Sometimes it's the Blackie from the CLA Blackie. I mean, you just really have to just try a bunch of different things and figure out which one suits the voice best. But in terms of the effects I named, that's pretty much something I always start with.
Cool. And piggybacking on that, Robert T asks, what made you decide that Fab Filter EQ should be one of your go-tos? Is it because you're depending on the visual aspect of it, or is it the feel or what you're hearing out of it? What makes that one of your favorites?
Well, I do enjoy the visual aspect of it. I mean, that's kind of a bonus. No, it's such a powerful EQ and it's so transparent. It doesn't color the sound and it's
Mhm.
just super powerful. So I like it for that reason, that it's really easy to use. I do appreciate the visual um, aspect of it, but no, it's primarily down to its function, and
Mhm.
that I use it as corrective EQ because it's so transparent. It's so transparent. It's just like the way I record stuff. It's pretty colored to begin with. I try to commit to a vibe, and then so if when I'm working in the mix, the EQ that I want to primarily do is just sort of getting things to fit around each other. And then if I need more vibe and color, then I'll pull up something else to kind of change the vibe of it.
Right, right. Cool stuff. All right. Here's a good one from Ray McCartney who asks, what record are you most proud of? If you have trouble narrowing it down to one, maybe you can give us two or three, but do any come to mind that are ones that you look back with great fondness in your career?
I would say, I mean, I'm proud of so many of them. I would say the one that I hold the highest is probably the Tom Waits Mule Variations.
Yep. I had a feeling you were going to say that one.
Yeah,
That's what
it's
was
kind
coming
of
to mind
hard.
for me. I'm like, let it be Mio variations. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard not to. It's just like on the first floor of my studio. I have a lot of gold and platinum records. I'm really grateful for. Have a lot, most of them at home. Don't really like having that stuff around the studio. I'm not like,
Intimidating
yeah,
to
I don't really want
artists
to
too
show
much.
off.
Right.
There's a bunch of stuff up in my office, but there is the one album, the one gold record that I have on the first floor studio that you see when you're here is Tom Waits Mule Variations.
Yeah, it's a great record. I mean, he's one of my favorite artists of all time. So I'm
Oh,
just
absolutely, absolutely.
super envious that you got to work with him, and he's just such a great talent. It's a beautiful sounding record. So fantastic work
Thank
there.
you, thank you.
All right, let's keep on going here. Leo Logan asks Jacquire, would love to know your thoughts on studio design. What do you think of a control room and tracking in one big room as opposed to splitting it up into two smaller rooms?
I mean, I love it as long as recording in one big space and working in one big space, which I've done many times. Uh, is as long as you can make it work to understand what it is you're capturing and be able to work effectively. I think it's great. I don't really less traditional studio spaces really appeal to me. By the looks of, it's like I have professional sound treatment and I have good isolation from my control room to my live room. So I think some of those things are certainly important, but I like non-traditional spaces more than I like, purpose-built studio spaces. I didn't really do a lot in my in my space other than build walls inside of walls to increase the isolation, and put up the sound treatment so that I could listen in controlled environments.
So
But
it's
I
a mostly
didn't.
rectangular room. It's not like a super fancy, all these avoiding parallel, all that
I
stuff.
mean, in the live room, we have one long wall that does sort of is like there's one wall. The two long walls are like this. Okay.
Gotcha.
And that I did that purposely to kind of get away from too much,
Hmm.
because in my recording space, I don't want too much buildup and weirdness and trying to record stuff. My control room is basically a square.
Hmm.
It's not ideal, and it took a while to get the speaker placement right and get the sound treatment right, but I understand it really well now, and
That's the
so
biggest thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's just understanding your speakers and being in a quiet enough listening environment.
Hmm. All right. I hope we have time for a few more here. Eric, I apologize if I don't get your name right. I think it might be French. Eric Thibault, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong here. Cool to see you using the H3000. How do you typically approach using this device? Are you using presets for inspiration, or are you creating your own patches?
I typically start with a preset. I do have a few of my own patches, but they all sort of were born from presets. So, I just kind of fly around. You fly around through different presets and try things. It's like at this point, I kind of know the things I like, but it's just, so then, I'll kind of go to a preset, load it up, and then modify it to fit the aesthetic.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's a fun box. I like having effects going while I'm recording.
Mhm.
So, a little bit of distortion, a little bit of delay, a little bit of reverb, and then, sometimes I use the 3000 for symphonic, harmonic types of effects, pitch shifting things, chorusing room sounds. Uh, so sometimes I just use it as a reverb. So it just sort of depends, what sort of flavors I might be just searching for. And sometimes I just kind of like randomly load up presets to sort of see what happens.
Mhm. Yeah. All right. Here's another question. I really like this one. This is from Cristobal Reyes, who says, do you have some advice to learn how to compress or how to approach it without the fear of messing up?
Um, well, just don't start with too high of ratios. Just do a lot of experimenting around 4 to 1. Um, you know, Now, like on the vocals, you're going to say, "Well, Jacquire, you're compressing quite a lot," and I am, but I do it with some experience. Like if on a mix, you don't really want, on my mix bus, I don't really want more than 2 to 4 dB of on a ratio, and I just want it to slightly touch it. So it just takes experience. Don't be afraid to try. Don't be afraid to try. And if you end up liking a really extreme setting, because it's got some energy and a vibe to it, but it's also kind of hurting the transient energy and the clarity of something. That is totally the cue to move it to a parallel position and then
Mm,
blend it in, right?
yeah.
um, and spend a lot of time playing with the attack and release of all the compression you have to understand how fast and slow it can be, and how it interacts, and how letting a slightly slower attack time let the transients through and the brightness through, and when it's too fast, how the sound starts to dull down and cover up, and like if your release time is too long, how the sound is not coming back up to let the next transient through. So it's kind of like, it's like a rhythm machine in a way between the attack and release. You just have to play with it. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to experiment. Don't be afraid to make a mistake. If you're afraid to make a mistake, you're not going to learn anything.
Yep.
Um, I have never ever learned anything of significant value from the things I've done right. I
Mm,
always learn way more from the things I get wrong
yeah.
and the mistakes I made. And when I have to go back, and experience tells you how to do things better because you make mistakes, not because you do things successfully. Of course, success builds confidence, but that's not really how we learn. We learn from experimenting and making errors. Failure is never the only way you can fail is to just give up and quit. It was like making a mistake is not failure. Making a mistake is an opportunity to learn and improve it, make it better next time.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely great. And you're right. I mean, to learn how to compress well, you're going to have to spend time compressing badly, and you're going to have to overuse compressors to the extent where, like you said, you can start to identify that sound of now my transients are gone, identify that sound of the release isn't coming back, identify the sound of, wow, the release is so fast that's starting to sound trashy, those kinds of things. So
Yeah,
yeah,
a really fast release will give you a distortion-like quality.
yeah,
It was so, you know,
yeah,
that, and these are, I mean, that these are tools you learn to use. If, but here's the thing: if you like a compressor vibe, but it feels like, you know, like I said, if you like a compressor vibe, but it feels like it's a little heavy-handed, move it to a parallel spot, keep that sound, and then blend it in. It's like reverb. Parallel compression is like almost like adding reverb to something. You know, it's just like just sweetens it a little bit. So, you know, think about it that way.
right, yeah. We did have one person ask during the actual premiere. They didn't put the question back in here, but I was curious. They said that you said you wound up with 3 different mics on the 3 different singers here.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall what they were, or just in general? Another person asks here what some of your favorite vocal mics are. So just if you can give us some comments on
Well,
choosing.
favorite vocal mics are really, you know, because it really depends on, sometimes the most unsuspecting, you know, mic will be the best mic for someone's voice. I mean, I've ended up, you know, trying a U47, an M49, a C37. You know, those are all great, beautiful old tube mics, right? Vocal tube mics on someone's voice, and none of them sounded as good as a Sennheiser 421.
Mm-hmm.
So I use the 421. So vocals, just you have to sort of you have to sort of audition a bunch of microphones to find which one fits the voice best. On the Saratoga song, um, Devin, who, you know, Devin was on my Flea 47. Griffin was on an Advanced Audio FET 47, and Mike was on an Advanced Audio C12.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Cool.
you know, and thing is, I had all of them sing on all the mics, but those particular ones sounded the most suitable for them, and I didn't want them all. Well, first of all, a lot of times they're singing at the same time, so I had to have them separate on separate mics. But I didn't want this. I didn't want the same microphone on each on the different voices, because then it would make them sound more similar. It's kind of like the same filter. So I wanted to find the best microphone for each voice to kind of keep the separation.
Cool stuff. All right. Another question here about monitoring. This is a question a couple of different people have brought it up. Casper brought it up, and someone else here. I just want to see if I can put a few of these questions together. They're asking about your choices in monitors. From what I remember seeing, you have Oratone in there, you have the KRKs and the big Amphion's.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about how you settled on the types of speakers you did and what you look for out of each of them, and any advice you'd give to other people in choosing their speakers?
Well, I think you should, you know, before choosing some speakers, if you can, listen to music you like on them, and see if it translates and sounds familiar to the way that you remember or feel the music has sounded or should sound. Um, speakers are really a lot about taste, and I think everyone should have a small set of speakers, because there's a lot of small speakers in the world. You should. I like the Amphions because they are super. They kind of are. They're a cross between high fidelity and like a studio monitor, where it's just very plain and honest. Because especially in a studio monitor, I want something where the mid range is really clear. I don't like a lot of what has become a very common speaker approach these days, of where you have these powered speakers that have really shiny sounds, you know, like they're really extended, where the top is really bright and the bottom is really heavy, and it just kind of already, everything you put through them sounds like the smiley face already. You don't
Mhm.
really do the work that you need to do. You need to hear the mid range really well to because that's where pretty much the most of the energy is, and you need to get those things sorted out. Um, you know, I like my KRK Rocket 5s because now the first generation were the ones that I fell in love with. The second and third generations weren't as good. I stopped using them for a while, and then Rich Rankin and I, well, Rich was working at KRK, and he's no longer there, but he wanted to sort of get back to the original version, so I helped him along with a bunch of other people helping him kind of get to the KRK Rocket 5 Generation 4. I like those. I use those a lot. Those are what are here. But primarily I'm listening to my Amphions, and it's really just about clarity. But at the end of the day, it is about personal preference. If you like the way music sounds on a certain set of speakers, and you like working on them, go for it. You need to listen to music and get familiar with them and understand how things are going to translate. At the end of the day, that's all that really matters.
All right. Good stuff. I know you've got to head out in just a minute here. One fellow named Utsanut has written to us 3 questions, and he really, really wants us to hit at least one of them. So he has questions about hardware. So I'm going to read all of his questions, and you see if you can take one of these. He says, I love how you use the Studer on the mix bus. How would you compare it to the Neve 542 tape emulator? He also asks, if we don't have Luna with Neve summing, how else can we get that Neve sound? Are there plugins you'd recommend, like how about the Cush Audio Transformer? How would you get that Neve sound if you didn't have Luna? And the third question he asks is, even with the best plugins, would you recommend one piece of outboard gear? I'm thinking of the SSL Fusion, something like that. So he's basically asking, outside of the Luna world and potentially in the analog world, what are some of your favorite things that you recommend, either hardware or plugins, for getting analog?
The Kazrog True Iron is a great transformer emulation. I mean, that's kind of what the most significant thing about the Neve summing in Luna is you're getting that Neve transformer sound. So it's a very inexpensive and awesome plugin, Kazrog True Iron. And don't have experience or familiarity with that SSL piece, that summing box. But you don't have to have Luna or Universal Audio to get tape emulations. So we discussed a few options previously in the chat about like the Isotope ones, the vintage tape one's really, really good. I don't know if you can buy it as a separate piece. Or not, but there's a lot. There's some options out there. One piece of gear to get as a piece of hardware, that's, I would say, probably a good stereo compressor. Something that will function like, what would be a good one? Because it'd be nice to be able to have something you could track with, but then also mix with. That's a tough one. Maybe a pair of distressors. Maybe a pair of distressors, because they're probably, the distressor is probably the greatest modern analog compressor ever made, or in the last
30 years now. They still seem so modern, but
they are. I mean, there has not been a better modern compressor made. I mean, there's a lot of cool compressors out there, don't get me wrong, but like the flexibility and bang for buck that you get out of a distressor. Of course we have to invest in microphones, but those are typically the last place that I think someone starting out should invest a lot of money, because you only use them for half of the time. And if you're going to, a lot of people are now aspiring to be mix engineers, and they don't record as much as maybe they mix. That's kind of a poor place to park your money. So I think now I used to use a passive summing box roll audio. It was called the Fulcrum. Which was awesome, like Kings of Leon, Only by the Night, Nora Jones. I mixed a lot of records through that setup, and I used you have to have mic pre's to use that piece of gear. So mic pre's are also good investments. I probably, if you're going to buy just if you're going to start out with a mic pre, I might get like an API, something that's a little bit in between, sonically in between an SSL and a Neve. Get an API, pair of APIs, and then there's a lot, there's a lot of choice. There's so many choices out there, and there's a lot of good kits you can build too.
Yeah, true story. All right, Jacquire, we're coming up onto an hour here. I know we've got to let you go. You've been super generous with your time.
My pleasure.
Let's see if we can do only last two questions that have come up that have been asked a few times, and then
Yep.
we just gotta let Jacquire go. So we're gonna try to keep these lightning round 60-second answers. Number
Okay.
one, fella asking, I'm seeing a lot more digital amp recording these days. People going to Kempers, Helixes, etc. Do you still prefer recording big, loud guitar amps, small amps, or digital? To you, is analog still better? And we have a couple questions along those lines. So,
I, I do like using emulations occasionally. I would say I'm still kind of a amp person.
Mhm.
And that's why I use the aux so much, because it's still the sound of, amps, but it speeds the process up. You don't have to have, you can, you don't have to have isolation for the amps, but you can still get that loud tone out of it. So I still sort of would prefer to record amps, and the aux is sort of more and more is becoming the way that I do that.
Sweet. All right. Last question for you. I think this is a good one to end on. And the question has come up in a couple of different ways here. How do you avoid burnout and stay inspired coming back doing record after record? What is your advice for that?
Listen to listen to a lot of music, try to stay inspired. Sometimes that means I go through periods of time where I listen to a bunch of old stuff. Sometimes I listen to new stuff. I get outside. I spend time with my friends. I exercise. I take care of my health.
Yeah.
And I do things like this. I share my knowledge, and many of my friends do this kind of thing too, and I watch their content, so I'm the same as everybody else. I need to take stuff in to be inspired. I need to take care of myself, because I do get burned out. It just happens. It just happens. We get tired, and just try to renew that well all the time. And it's not just about music. It's about having a balance in life.
Yeah.
And getting out into the world and sort of understanding what's going on. It always brings me back to what my passions are, and my passions are recording and making music. So it's nice to get a break. But when I go sit on the beach for 2 weeks or whatever, it's just like I enjoy that, and it's healthy and it's good for me. But then I spend a lot of time thinking about going back to the studio and working.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's balance.
Beautiful. I couldn't think of a better place to end it. Thank you so much, Jacquire, for your time. Really appreciate it. You've been super generous with us, the masterclass, and this as well. Big shout out and thanks to Universal Audio for sponsoring this, making it free to the public. Definitely check out the full masterclass from Jacquire if you haven't already. We're also giving away free stuff. If you like free stuff, you can go to sonicscoop.com/MixCon giveaway. That's SonicScoop. Let me see if I can type it in for you guys. .com/MixCon giveaway. We're giving away thousands of dollars worth of free stuff from all the sponsors from this. So definitely check that out, and check out Jacquire. Where are the best places for people to follow you and keep up with you and all that good stuff?
Instagram is probably I have a Facebook, but I don't really pay attention to it. I just kind of push everything there from Instagram.
He's one of the young cool kids. Check him out on Instagram. Jacquire King, thanks again for taking the time. Thank you guys for hanging out. This has been Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop with Jacquire King from MixCon. See you next time.
Peace out.
Bam. All right. We're all set. I appreciate it, man. I know you've got a stop right here, so I